When I think back on all the fears when I was pregnant, all of them dismissed except for one. The only test the state mandated was genetic. Looking for that extra chromosome.
Hello and welcome to the If We Knew Then podcast. I'm Stephen Sachs,
And I'm Lori Sachs.
and today we're joined by Olivier and Hilda, who are documentarians of a fantastic film, Forget Me Not, Inclusion in the Classroom.
Forget Me Not tells the story of our children's fight for an equal education, raising the question of inclusion versus segregation. And it's this documentary that is so important to make the changes in the lives of individuals with Down syndrome and disabilities and their fight for an education. This documentary is an important film. I don't think people understand what our children go through in their fight for an equal education and the narrative that's pushed. And it shines a light on the fact that anything other than an inclusive classroom is a classroom that is segregated. This film is enlightening to educators, to families who can see how systematic the denial of our children's education is. Please welcome Hilda and Olivier. Hello. Good morning.
Good morning.
We're really excited to have you here because it's been a year since we actually were introduced to your film, and we were immediately moved by the film and saw its pertinence. We would have liked to have made that film, and the fact that you made that film made us feel so good because there's something about this journey that the only way that it changes, and even though those changes seem to happen very slowly, is for the stories to be told. So it was really great. I'll be honest, part of it was heartbreaking to just see that you guys were literally walking in the same footsteps that we walked in. So there was a part of us that were a bit devastated that, you know, if any change, that the change is happening so slowly. But we're so happy that you made your film. Could you introduce yourself to the audience and then maybe talk a little bit about yourselves?
My name is Olivier Bernier. I was the director of Forget Me Not, and I'm also the father of Emilio, the star of the film. And yeah, it was we started the film when he was about 2 years old, but we had used a lot of the footage from his earlier life, and that's what turned into Forget Me Not.
And I am Hilda Maria Bernier. I am the producer of the documentary, and I am also a subject alongside Emilio and Olivier in this documentary that it kind of felt like a logical progression into my life. I am a former special education teacher and bilingual education teacher. So during the time that we were filming the documentary, I got to reflect a lot on my career and the things I learned through my kids and all the students I got to work with.
One of the things that we loved about the film was how raw it is. And I think anybody who's on this journey, it's such a nice, you know you're not alone. And there's a bit, like for us, a bit of it was that is this really happening? You get people who are like people in positions of power that you think might know, are supposed to know, and you're getting information that doesn't feel right. If this film would have been around when Liam was born, I think it would have helped support me in my advocacy and in understanding what the truths and the propagation of false information that is really fed to us. So I thank you for that.
Thanks for saying that. I think, early on, then I had a lot of discussions of what to include and what not to include. And we ultimately decided that anything and everything has to go in there as long as it serves the storytelling. So, there was a lot of discussions, do we include the ugly moments, the bad moments, the pretty moments, the beautiful moments? And ultimately, we decided to make a film that was really just experiential and reflective of our experience, and hoped that people would be able to see themselves in that experience. So, a lot of that footage, as you mentioned earlier, was from before we received a grant to make a documentary. It was just family footage. But there's some beautiful moments, but there's also some really difficult moments that you see up front in the film. And I think all of those together kind of are combined in a soup that makes what we call life, and we just wanted to put that out there and hope that it could create as much impact as possible.
Well, it definitely does that, and we could go into like some specifics of the documentary, but I also don't want there's that balance between like a teaser of it and then also maybe giving away too much. But what do you want listeners to know about your documentary?
That's a great question. You know, the first thing to know is that when we started making the documentary, we were not part of the documentary. We started making a film. I was a father that had a 2-year-old child with Down syndrome, and I needed to know what education was going to look like for Emilio. So we wanted to make a film about inclusive education. And I knew nothing about inclusive education. Ilda knew a lot about it, but I kind of had to go on my own journey as a filmmaker and as a father to try to understand what would Emilio's life look like in an inclusive setting versus a segregated setting. And I grew up in a place where I had never met anyone with Down syndrome. And I went to a high school of over 2,000 students. And I had this nagging thought in the back of my head, how could I have never met anyone with a significant disability in a school with 2,000 students? And what I realized pretty quickly is that they were hidden from us. And I'd never thought about it. But when Emilio came to us, I was completely unprepared. I was scared. I was lost. And I think that's what led me on my journey to try to understand what is inclusive education. How can we make Emilio part of society as opposed to hidden from society? And that's really what led to the genesis of the film. And as we were making that film, Emilio started going down a track of being segregated, like many other children. Like sounds like Liam was also. And we started to turn the camera on ourselves, and that's kind of how we ended up with the film that we have today.
Well, words are so important, and it just hits me so hard when you talk about inclusive and segregated, because the word segregated is not used. We use it on the podcast, and it's almost seemed revolutionary when we started using it, even in our daily lives. But that's the true opposite of inclusion. That's not. I don't know if we're just being too nice about it, or we just set up to say the words that educational people give us, but it is impactful when you say segregated, and it needs to be used.
Yeah, I think it's the education departments across the nation did a really good job at rebranding segregation by using the term special education. Um, you know, you walk into a special ed class often, and you can see sometimes that there's no learning going on. Um, it in some places it's more of a babysitting kind of situation, and for me to me as an educator and as a parent, that it really strikes a nerve and makes me really angry, that we are using these terms where, like, people that don't have kids with disabilities, they think that special ed classes are these magical places where these magical things happen. Um, but then you have, a neurotypical child that's on a school that has over 1,000 students that has never seen a friend with a disability. Using the term segregation becomes key in this for this matter, to bring the message that that has to stop, and we need to start educating our children together from the very first stages of their lives. So that's one of those things that I really try to remember and communicate to be parents of kids that have disabilities and that don't have disabilities as well.
And I mean, if you just flip the narrative, what are you doing? I mean, you're taking a child who was born with a certain set of traits, and you're telling them they don't belong with other kids because of the way they were born. I mean, that is the definition of segregation. So, as Ida mentioned, you have a general education class, you have maybe an inclusive or integrated class, and then you have special education. So, as Ida mentioned, it's branding, and it's really, if we just call it what it is, it's going to look a little darker and uglier, and then maybe people will respond to it.
I love so much of what you just said, to be honest.
yeah.
I love that you call it rebranding, because Olivia, you're saying that society tells our kids they don't belong. First, they tell us our children don't belong. And it was very, our friend Ted Green did a documentary on Carl Erskine, and he played with Jackie Robinson. He was all about inclusion. His son was then born with Down syndrome, and he was a great advocate for his son. For as much as during a time when you were actually, as parents, told that your child would be the disintegration of your family unit, and your child was taken away from you, and that wasn't that long ago, which is the great reminder that it wasn't that long ago, and that it still occurs in certain ways, and that it was still occurring in that very real way. John's Crazy Socks, the guy who created
Oh yeah, right.
John from John Crazy, like not very long ago, they were
he's
trying to
25.
sell it as summer school, and he insisted to go look at it, and they were like, no, you can't. And it was an institution. So it's still happening. And I feel like it's, through telling our stories and also calling it what it is, because really this started with pushing a different narrative. The whole, like, taking your individuals with disabilities and making them less than started when they needed to make someone's value be on what that they could produce, right? So one of the things I try to do is when I hear like a tradition or something said a certain way, I always ask people, well, why do you say that? Do you know where that comes from? And most of the time, that's how these things get propagated, is because we weren't there when it started. We don't know where it came from, and that ball is just rolling. And that's what this education system has done. Like, it's so smart to call it rebranding of segregation, because people don't realize that this is happening to individuals with disabilities, very prolifically to individuals with Down syndrome. And our kids are being denied their education now, no longer institutionalized. Once they're denied their education, and then they get to the end of high school and they haven't been educated at all, then they say that's Down syndrome. But it isn't. It's a system that has failed our child. And, we started maybe in 5th grade when our son was actually denied his right to an education, like no FAPE, no placement, and done in a way that was just like, you're not going to do anything about it. Like literally, he was denied FAPE. And that's when we started to call it segregation. Like, the opposite of inclusion is not non-inclusive.
Right.
The opposite of inclusion is segregation. And we just say it now because it's very empowering. I feel like this journey gets steamrolled by the narrative that they're trying to push. Very early on, they get parents in their pockets by telling you, your child won't do, here's a laundry list. We have tried to systematically go through that laundry list and debunk that, like with interviews of individuals who are married, who have children, who drive cars, who go to college, all of these things that they tried to sell us. So maybe we can rebrand it. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe we as parents can rebrand it and call it, because the truth is, no other group of marginalized people, one instance of this
Wouldn't be allowed.
It wouldn't be allowed. It would be all over CNN. It would be all over everywhere. Just like, can you believe this one instance is happening? Do you know?
And our experiences is we're in Los Angeles, you're in New York. These are the two biggest school districts in the country, and we've obviously we know in between us, it's happening everywhere. This isn't that's the thing that when you talk about being a bit heartbroken after seeing the documentary, but then also relieved that there's someone else feeling it. It
Someone else calling it out.
yeah.
We
right.
don't want anybody else. We don't want anybody else to feel this. And then, but they are. But I can guarantee every family who is experiencing what you experienced, what we experienced, thinks they're the only one experiencing it. They're buying the story that the district, like when they were like, we watched when they were like, oh, first you can record. And then the next time you met with them, they realized they met with their lawyers, they did. And they were like, you can't record. And I was like,
record the
no,
IP.
You're allowed. Like I'm screwed. Like
Yeah,
it
you
was
can
a
record the
horror
IP.
film. I was screaming at the documentary going, no, have them put it in writing. Tell them. But what it did draw light to is that this is a system. This is a system that they have in place, and they get parents when it's your child. You don't know what's fact, you don't know what's fiction until you're at the other end of it, and then you look back and go, "Oh my goodness!" And they just push it, and they get you, like you said, like you have your evaluation coming up. Like I remember that, my face would go numb. No parent should feel that way, especially about elementary school.
Yeah, and it's very unfortunate that the people that are holding these meetings, doing these evaluations, and like making these decisions, they are trying to sell this idea, that the special class is going to be better, and a lot of parents, especially in large cities like New York, they work 1, 2 jobs. They don't have the time to, find advocates, learn the law, like really know what everything is about. So they really trust these people that are making these decisions for them, thinking that they are the experts. But like since I was already in the field, I I was very cautious because I knew that that at some point it was going to happen due to the diagnosis that Emilio has. So it's very unfortunate that they are not even like following their own laws, because the law is very clear. IDEA stipulates that the child has to be educated in the least restrictive environment first. And so the least restrictive environment is general education, especially when you have a child going into preschool. What are we saying, that the child cannot learn preschool content with other peers their age? It's a practice that really has to change, because it's like a bad pitch that these administrators are putting to the families in order to fill space in certain places.
And to go back to something you said earlier, Lori, is there has been a tremendous amount of change and progress since the 50s, 60s, 70s, since they shut down the institutions. But I think what we haven't truly seen is a change of mindset by the general public, by the people that aren't affected by someone with a disability directly. People still believe that people with disabilities can't function in a normal society. And the truth is, there are some challenges. Society isn't really built for people with different abilities. But I think that what's happening is that, it's just, we got rid of the institutions, but now we're kind of rebuilding them within schools. And I think that's the next step, is we need to break that barrier down.
That's so well put.
And the truth is that like they just sell it so well, and they haven't changed. Like they had to tear down the buildings most of them. They had to tear that down, but they just transitioned it, and they just transitioned it to the education that, we had to fight for an equal education. And people think it was a long time ago, but it wasn't. We just celebrated the anniversary of IDEA, and it wasn't that long ago. But also the fact that they are continuing to deny that. The conversation that is said is that by law our child has the right to an equal education in the least restrictive environment, and they have to prove that your child doesn't belong there. So anytime before high school, you can't make that judgment. There are so many ways in which it's unequal. Our society you say that our society isn't made to account for individuals that are different, but that's not the truth. It's individuals whose differences we judge as being less, and we only judge those differences by the ability to see those differences. Like if I can see the color of your skin, if I can see who you love, if I can see by the shape of your eyes what I deem to be your ability, I don't eat like the general public will look at my son and have so many preconceptions about what his ability is. And again, they don't know where they come from. They don't come from the fact.
No, because like you said, Olivier, we didn't go to school with kids with disabilities. So what do we really know, right?
Right.
We're only hearing what is being passed down. Again, that needs to be rebranded. And the way that can be rebranded is to keep kids with disabilities in the general population, where these kids in kindergarten and preschool, where they're trying to get kids out of the general educational system and put them in a special day class or something. By not doing that, then you have these young kids that are actually experiencing a classroom with a kid with Down syndrome or whatever, and seeing how they are an asset in the classroom, seeing what they can bring to the classroom, just like every kid has something to bring and something to learn. And once we continue to do that and keep our kids in the general education as much as,
the general, you're being kind. Aren't we so kind? Aren't we so kind?
Yes.
That these people who I don't even care anymore about putting my child in the education so these people can see. That's not my job. Your job is uphold their right. Everything else will fall into place. I feel like as parents, we're like, if you could just see what an asset, see what they can do. Nobody's showing me what their kid can do. Most people are lying to me about what their kid can do. And then they show up and we're like, they can't play the piano. That's horrible. Do you know? It's like, our children deserve equal rights. And it's not my responsibility if you are closed-minded. It's not my responsibility if you're such an old teacher that you haven't bothered to re-educate yourself on how to be a powerful, effective leader. That's not my responsibility. And it took me so long to discover that. It's your responsibility, and it is actually the law. And I want parents to know that the law is an equal education with the least restrictive environment, and that it's the burden is on them. And if they give you all this information that proves in their eyes, my first question is, these are the ways that you're failing my child. What will we do so you're not failing my child? And I want parents to have that sentence when they go into an IEP, because boy, won't they hand you all the charts? Won't they give you all the lists? Won't they tell you all the things? And the next question needs to be, well, how are you going to fix that?
What are you going to do?
Because the burden is on you to educate my child. Bring this, segregation and discrimination. Those are two hothouse words, and bring them to your IEP, and don't be afraid to say them, because that's exactly what they're doing. It is discrimination if you are not giving my child the same right based solely upon his disability.
As good as IDEA is, I think there's one major flaw with the law, and that's this idea of least restrictive environment. It's something that took me a long time to wrap my head around, but it's this weird gray zone where schools can almost do whatever they want with it. And I think that's the next generation of the law needs to really remove that language, and a lot of countries have removed that language. I believe the UK has removed it. Because what it becomes, it can actually become a tool for segregation, saying that a student they're not performing well. Well, you know what? As you mentioned, does any other student have a magnifying glass the size of Emilio or Liam? Everything they're doing is being judged, and everything they're doing can be used against them. So what might be just a normal process of learning could be seen as a reason why they shouldn't be in a general education class. So I think, the concept of least restrictive environment, if the spirit of the term is used correctly, then I think it's great. But what happens is that schools can use it as a tool for removal. So I
And
think that's one of the hardest parts of IDEA to wrap your head around.
And to the point that you, Laurie, and that you, Olivier, just made, I think it's very ironic that we have our children that because the condition that they are born with, they have this magnifying glass over them constantly, and it's almost like the parents, we have to like encourage the teachers and the administrators to believe that they can, and then our kids have to somehow prove themselves that they are able to do these things in school, while you have a bunch of other children without IEPs that probably are having the same difficulties, but nobody's talking about it because they are not, they're not classified. It doesn't seem like they're struggling. So it's very, to me, it's very ironic how our kids just are in this constant battle to prove themselves, while like everybody else is just cruising through their school years and just uh, doing what kids that age do.
And I think the other part of it too is that you can't keep teaching kids in front of a blackboard and expecting them to all just kind of magically understand everything. I think schools and school systems really need to adopt universal design for learning and to give students multiple ways to access information. And I think that benefits every child. So when we talk about inclusive education, it's not just that you get to be around different types of students and that you learn about other humans and the way they live and the way they are. It's that you also are bringing new teaching methods into the classroom, and you're helping everybody in that sense.
I think the one thing that got dropped on Liam, and what happens in this like push of segregation, is they also forget like your child is entitled to an equal education with the supports they need. So those supports, I always tell parents, like those supports can be a BII, because a BII will keep your child on task, right? If
Man,
they
how many
have,
kids could use that?
right?
I mean,
but
just
the,
typical
but the
kids.
truth is like your child, because there is such a microscope on them, if they have the supports, like they used to put Liam in science, and we didn't know that that's when his BII would take a break, and nobody would support him. So nobody would take notes, and then they would fail him, and then they would use that failed grade against him in his IEP.
Mm-hmm.
So what it means is that as parents, we have to hold them accountable, and in our IEP say, I want weekly reports. And how are you supporting my child? And ask for the service logs to make sure that that is happening, because our child, the truth is, our child with the supports that are there by law will exceed the neurotypical children who are just in there allowed to be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Like those kids that are allowed to be like, the jellyfish caterpillar before it's a butterfly, those kids, they don't have that structure. And their brains are allowed to, especially like it happens when they're really young. And then it happens again in middle school when their brains are totally reforming. They're just like all over the place. Like if you go, it's only because I've sat in so many meetings that I realize, that paragraph that they're teaching them in the second grade or maybe the third grade, they start teaching a paragraph. It is the same breakdown all the way through high school. The same breakdown.
How to write a paragraph.
Because they know that the child's brain is rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding. So a neurotypical child gets the opportunity to learn the same thing
And fail.
over and over and over and fail. And what what they're teaching your child is how to fail. My son doesn't know how to fail because he's never been able to fail. Failure has such a large consequence for him.
That's such a great point. It's being allowed to fail is how you learn. I mean, I never even thought of it that way. But yeah, that's absolutely, Emilio's not allowed to fail, because if he fails, it's like all of a
He's out.
sudden
Yeah.
he's out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, a typical kid in the classroom that maybe is getting D's and F's. To be honest, there's a percentage of those kids, they're not going to be held back. They're not holding back a fifth grader for another fifth grade year. That elementary school wants to kick them down to middle school. And middle school's going to take all their kids and going to do 6th, 7th, and 8th and push them to high school. They're not holding kids back. And some kids could probably use another fifth grade or another 7th grade. But that's not happening. But for our kids, they're using all that against them, yes, to get them in a system that's a machine where they can just spit them out the other end. And it's very frustrating.
There's also a lot of pushback from teachers that have been doing the same thing forever, where they just kind of like are extremely worried about not being able to help the students that are at the performing at the higher levels in their classrooms, because they believe that children with developmental disabilities are going to drag everybody down, and that is a huge misconception. Like, you can actually put those talents from the higher performing kids to work in your favor, and like they can be working with the kids that have IEPs, in developing certain skills and learning from each other. But yeah, there is a lot of pushback when it comes to bringing our kids into the classrooms, because there's just not this understanding that if you change the way you teach, and you offer different ways to introduce an idea, that variation can benefit everybody.
I have such hope for the teachers that are coming up, because I feel like a lot of these individuals have been exposed to people, do understand there's so much more language about anxiety. There's such a opening up of the different abilities. You know what, Hilda, the one thing that I want to see change is that we are validating our child's existence in a classroom. That really smart kid that just they can help every student in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's really good for them to know how to support other individuals. I think that we impact the people that are in between when we say the smart people only help people with IEPs, because then it puts, like, especially until you're an adult, you don't understand we're all different in a very real way. I call it all the time in life. I'll be like, oh, we all heard that differently. We all need different supports to be able to do that, like in like the most random places. Because one thing that I became very aware of is students who were in the middle, no IEP, no real, like didn't show their difference, didn't present a difference. They absorb the way students who I can see their difference. They absorb how they're treated. And the message that sends is, don't be different. Don't let anybody know who you are. And I've experienced too many children committing suicide. And this is because our children are taught that if you're different, you're a burden and there's something wrong with you. So the importance of inclusion is, yeah, you can look at my son's eyes and no, but I'll be honest, sometimes I see people with almond-shaped eyes and I'm like, do they have Down syndrome? Like, I don't know. Like, I honestly don't know. I'll be like, oh, and then they don't. They just have almond-shaped eyes, for goodness sake. And what happens, are you laughing at
Like
me?
Russell from Up. I remember the movie Up. I'd be like, oh, but Russell
I was
might
so
have Down
excited
syndrome.
to see Russell
This is
because I was like,
amazing.
oh, and it's like, no, he just has almond-shaped eyes. I thought everybody in It's a Small World, I was like, gosh, Walt
Oh, at
Disney
Disneyland,
was
yeah.
so progressive, because that is a ride of children with almond-shaped eyes, and we all have them, right? It's a small world.
It is
We're
true.
all
They use like
connected.
the same model for like every country.
But
But
no,
anyway,
but honestly, like, but the message that it sends,
don't be different.
don't be different, and it puts a burden on people who are different for very many ways and are afraid to talk about it. Like there are learning differences that we don't, there's dyslexia. There's so many differences that people don't catch, but no kid wants to be called out. No kid wants to be a burden. No kid wants that archaic teacher that, like, for me, I'm like, come on, man. When people go, I've been doing this for years, we will say that does not bring us comfort because things have changed and inclusion has happened and diversity has happened. And if you don't believe in it, then that you're just going to be a challenge.
One thing we've been really encouraged by since the film has come out, then this is kind of when we made the film, we were thinking we want to make this film accessible to anybody who doesn't have a person with a disability in their life. Like take them on a journey and just make an interesting film, and maybe they'll learn something. And sure enough, that happened. But we're seeing the most kind of traction with the film is actually in the educational space. So, universities all over the country are seeing the film, and we're really encouraged by messages we receive from the next generation of teachers that are seeing this film, and it's kind of opening their eyes, I think. And I hope that those teachers go in there and drive change into schools. I know it's hard, especially big school districts like LA and New York. But I hope they're going with this energy and this, this spirit of that everybody deserves an equal opportunity to be educated in the same space, to learn from each other and with each other. And so that's one of the things that surprised me most, is that universities are using the film as a teaching tool. It's not something I expected, but definitely an outcome that I'm really proud of. And I think it's the film doing the work it was meant to do. And I hope we start to see more and more change with the next generation of teachers.
Because I don't think people know. I really don't. And I think that's a really great place to start, because I think if you get an like people who really get an education, I don't know if people get an education anymore, just to have summers off, which used to be the joke growing up, that teachers just did it to have the summers off. I don't think that's necessarily the situation anymore. And I think that it could be very disheartening if you went in because you want to make a difference, because you had a special teacher that you loved that made a difference in your life. And then you go into a system where I know some of these people in the IEPs, their hands are tied. Like they've told me I'm not supposed to say anything, or they've told me after the meeting I got in trouble because they advocated, because they spoke the truth. And I think like we had an OT, we had a resource teacher that actually kind of quit after everything that went down with Liam, because she was being forced not to educate him, and it's like and I think that impacts people who like want to sleep at night,
they care,
that really want to make a difference. And I think that like you said, the special education, the day class, like the proverbial short bus, like these are things that, I don't know, when you say the spirit of the law, maybe it was like, you think about the people in the 70s who had to then create a special day class, but they were raised thinking that people with disabilities were deviants and the destruction of, the family unit. Like this is the best they could do. Right? Like, okay, well, at least we'll because I don't think you're
gather
equal.
them all together.
I don't think we're equal. We'll put you all together in a room, and maybe one teacher once taught something in that room, but you're right. It's like revisiting something to say that we've progressed, and now this needs to change as well.
Yeah, one thing when we were making the film, I wanted to also know, like, how did this start? How did we start just putting children in institutions because they were born with a disability? Um, and what we found is that it really something that didn't happen in all of existence. It really started in the early 1900s with the eugenics movement, and suddenly, it was an effort to really remove people that were seen as deficient from society. And that's kind of what started the institutions. And then that just self-propagated, and from generation to generation we said, oh, that's what we do, we put the kids with disabilities there. And it's really led to horrible situations, especially as the institutions started receiving less and less funding from the federal government. And you saw horrible situations as you see in the film, and as you know, I think any parent of a child with a disability knows about. But it's amazing to me. It's absolutely amazing to me how many people don't know about this history. Like, how can we, we talk about famines and we talk about all these points in history when people were pushed aside, and instances of genocide, but as in the US we don't talk about this moment where we decided that everybody that we deemed deficient should be put in a, essentially like a room to never be seen again. And those were our institutions. So it's one thing that I think if you don't learn from history, you're bound to repeat it. And I hope that's why we included it in the film. It's a really dark part of our history, but it needs to be remembered and people need to know about it. And I think that it's something that should be taught in schools, that, Emilio needs to know that, if he was born in the 60s, I would hope that this wouldn't happen, but maybe he would have ended up in an institution. I would like to think that we would have been able to stay above the fray and say no. Um, but it was just the norm then. And I think that, knowledge is power. And if we can find a way to remind people that we're not that far removed from this place of deep, deep segregation of people with disabilities, then I think it's time to remind people that this could easily happen again, and we are seeing these trends getting worse and worse.
Well, I'd like to share an anecdote from my professional experience before being a mother. Because I used to work in a high school. I was a high school teacher, and when I came into this place, they only had what they call integrated co-teaching classrooms. So there were no special classes at all, and we had a cohort of students that came from middle school with IEPs that had a special class classification. So we had to create a class because that was what was on the IEP, and there was a significant amount of students. So like we had to do it. And what we learned very quickly, it was that was this largest disservice that we were doing to these children, because you have, a group of 8 to 10 students that are already living in harsh conditions in New York City, that have been marginalized the entire school career, and that are coming into high school and are finding that there are other thousands of students that are in there, that they know them from other places, know that they are boxed into this one classroom. So what happened was that some of them joined gangs, some of them had very spotty attendance, some of them just started like living up to the stereotype of their disabilities. Um, and it was sad and upsetting. And thankfully, I at that point in time I was working with a group of administrators and teachers that we all understood that, like, these children belong in the community, and they also need to be able to be with the other students, because down the road, they are going to be offering jobs to each other. They're going to be going to college with each other, or doing things, getting on the same subways, navigating the same spaces. So for us, it was very important to dissolve those classes, to prevent more of them to just stray from their high school experience.
It is one of those things where, because of all these things we're talking about, you can see now how our kids are set up and driven a place that is failure. And we could get into all the reasons why. I mean, it usually comes down to money. I didn't want to go there, but I'm so glad you included in your documentary about our history. And you're right, that needs to be taught. How did you decide? Because this is something, after seeing the documentary, I want to know, okay, what's happening now? How did you decide when and where to end the documentary? Like, how do you even get to a point where, okay, this is the end of this chapter, or this statement, or this art I'm creating?
That's a great question, and truthfully, the easy answer is that we had a grant and we had to finish the film by a certain point. So that was the first thing. But we were about 80% done editing the film, at least with the rough cut. And I said Emilio had gone through a year of school in this kind of like probationary inclusive setting, and we were sure that we were going to have a great IEP meeting in his second year of preschool, because his teacher had told us that he was performing really well, and that that he belonged there. So we decided, this is during the pandemic, we decided, hey, why don't we film this? This will be a really happy ending for the movie. And for anyone that's seen the film, they know what the outcome was. But unfortunately, we didn't get the happy ending that we were hoping for.
I wanted to say, Hilda, when you said about like that you see that students will live up to the expectation put on them, whether it be like their diagnosis or whatever, the room with the four walls with no expectation, off curriculum. I think that's really important to understand, because then that gets turned into, this is what, in our case, Down syndrome is, right? This is what happens. When you said about if Emilio had been born in the 60s, that you hope that you could have fought to keep him, but he might have ended up in an institution. I think about that because I know it was really hard, that how they sold it to parents. That's why parents put their kids in an institution. You can't take care of your kids. They're going to destroy your family.
This is better for them.
This is better for them. And that's what they did. That is the same narrative that they use. So now their institutions are gone. That is the same thing that's being fed to parents when it comes to the education. And I think that if we hold those two up, because the institutions were not good for our children in any way. And if parents could understand that they're just trading one room for another, because I feel like along with that, there's so much guilt. There's so much guilt that comes to the parent, but and in hindsight, we can look back and, some parents can say, I wish I would have raised my child. I wish I would have kept them out of the institution. I wish I would have fought for the education. Because honestly, once you get on that path where they do, we haven't had to fight for 2 years because we have a very inclusive school. We had to fight every year, which is so ridiculous in kindergarten to say, we're going to take your child off curriculum. Honestly, if you offer that to a neurotypical child and you go, then you won't ever have to do work, they'll be like, done, but they would never do that. And the fact that they successfully pull our kids off of curriculum, that's it, they successfully deny them an education through guilt, because, you say your question was, how do people not know about it? Because look at you. You're on the same journey as so many parents, but you found somehow the wherewithal to apply for a grant. That's a lot of paperwork to get the grant, to make this film, to get it edited, to do all. That was a lot of work, right? And it probably took its toll. A lot of parents don't have some of the strength, the story, the time, the storytelling ability. Not that you had any more time, but the storytelling ability. Knowing the power of media, they're just one still, because the way the diagnosis is given to them, still trying to absorb that, still trying not to, some people just consume it 100%. This is my child's path. And because just like you said, if they consume what they're told about what their child's life will be, it will be what their life will be. And once they get to a place, there's just so much guilt, and there's so much undue work put on us that is why people don't know the story. When you meet a new parent, sometimes the only thing you want to be is a parent. want to have to, like, because we spent so many years and we carried that with us and we carried the fight. And like, I know I'd walk into a room. I'm sure people know me very specifically as the woman who told you about the injustice in the school. Anybody who talked to me before, like 2 years ago, like that's the first thing I told, like, how's Liam? I'll tell you how Liam is. He's had to fight for his education since kid. And every year we have to hire a lawyer and they denied him his, like, that's, and it's exhausting.
Yes.
And that is why I believe that the story isn't out there. Because when I do tell, and like I told a parent whose children went to private school and they were like, I was like, the reason there are no kids with Down syndrome, like, why doesn't Liam, what school does Liam, somehow Liam, I was like, they test and no child with Down syndrome will pass the test.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't have individuals with disabilities in your school. You think you're going to this great progressive private school and you're going to a very segregated institution. Honestly, I don't think I've ever had someone go, oh, that makes sense. I want my child to get an education. Most of the time, they are horrified. They're horrified to know that this has actually happened because most of the time they've met my son and they know that he's very able. So maybe that's why it's changing. You're making films, people are putting stories out there. But I believe that's also what the school system knows. That's like, I see a lot of places where laws need to be changed, where schools need to be compensated a certain amount when they have individuals who have IEPs. So that way the teachers don't feel it a burden on their resources, or the schools don't see it as a burden, because that's part of it. Part of it is that the narrative is being propagated. And the other part of it is they don't have the extra tools. They don't have the supports, and that needs to change. And I see that, I'm aware of it, but I don't know how to change a law. I don't know how to fight for the change of the law. And because on a daily basis, I'm trying to make sure that my child is receiving an education. Again, not so much now that he's in an inclusive environment. But before that, when I was having to write these long emails, when I was having to send letters to the district, when I was having to go through due process, I didn't have the ability to. And they know that that's what they're up against. And I think that's kind of the wave that they ride, that this parent has to choose what they do.
Well, if schools just reallocate their resources in a smarter way, we should, these conversations would start kind of like fading away, because there's this conception that kids with IEPs like are going to drive the funds of the schools. But in the end, like if you put, let's say, like two teachers in a classroom, and then you have a student, let's say like Emilio, that has a one-to-one paraprofessional going into that classroom as well. At the end of the day, like everybody's tapping into that classroom. All the other students are also asking for help to Emilio's paraprofessional, and at the end of the day, it just creates a better environment for everybody, and it provides more support to the gen teachers that also are not necessarily trained on teaching students with disabilities. So reallocating the resources, it's almost more cost effective than just sending them into one particular building or one particular classroom.
When we were making the film, there was a big question of whether we'd be able to include the IEP meetings in the film. Ultimately, we had to get just kind of how the sausage is made. When you make a film, you have to get it insured in order to release it to the public, because anybody can come and sue you. So part of the process is that lawyers have to review the film and see what the likelihood of getting sued would be, basically. And then an insurance company has to come and insure your film. So we had to go through a lot of reviews in order to get the film to a place where we can include the IEP meetings. And the reason why we wanted to include that is because I think that every time a student gets included, it's opening the door for another student. And I wanted to show parents that, like, this is a fight that's worth fighting, because you may just be fighting for your own child, but you're opening a door for so many children after that child. So everything that you've done for Liam, for example, the school district knows the fight that parents are going to put up, and that Liam can be successful. And that's changing minds, and one student at a time, one school district at a time. And I think that that's why it's so important that all parents of children with disabilities fight tooth and nail and just go as hard as they can to try to get their student in a general education class. And not everybody has the time or the ability to do that, or the money for lawyers or advocates. And we feel really fortunate that we did receive a grant, a really generous grant, to make this film, and I was able to combine my profession with my passion, which was Emilio. But not everybody has that, and that idea of guilt is really strong, I think, with parents with disabilities. Like, are we doing enough? Are we doing everything we can? But anything you can do is amazing, and keep doing it, is what I tell parents, because the more we all fight together, for this generation of people with disabilities, it's gonna help the next generation behind them.
I remember an email that you sent before, at the end of last year, going into the summer, Hilda, and you were afraid that you hadn't done enough. You were wondering if you had done enough. And our friend Mazen had reminded us that advocating is just showing up. And that's what makes the difference, is you're showing up and you're there. Your child, whatever their experience is, they know that you were there. Other people always try to tell each other what their value is and what their worth is. But your student will receive the message that you don't get to tell me who I am. I get to tell me who I am. And that's why we're so happy that you made this film. We do believe that the more people that see it, especially with educators coming through, that it is one of the pieces of the puzzle that will help us to see the evolution of change for individuals with disabilities and Down syndrome. And I'm excited to see what Emilio's journey ends up being, in hopes that one day this conversation will be like, I can't believe they had that conversation. I think this is one of the pieces in that change. To make our advocacy obsolete is really what my goal is.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us, and thanks so much for all that you do to help spread the message of inclusion.
Please follow us on Twitter at If We Knew Then Pod, and you can drop us a line on our Facebook page at If We Knew Then Pod, or visit our website, ifweknewthen.com, to send us an email with questions and comments. And you can join our mailing list there and get alerts of future podcast episodes. All these links will be added to this episode's show notes. Thank you again, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode of If We Knew Then.